Hello, and welcome to Oak Island Theories. In this video, we are going to explore the theory that the lost jewels of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, lie at the bottom of the money pit. Let's take a look.
According to some Oak Island theorists, most notably former United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Oak Island's treasure consists of the crown jewels of France. Proponents of this theory typically hold that the French Queen Marie Antoinette entrusted her lady-in-waiting with the jewels' safekeeping during the height of the French Revolution. In the wake of the 7 Years' War, France, for centuries one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, had lost much of its wealth and international prestige. Burdened with post-war debt and all but bankrupt, France found itself in a serious financial crisis 11 years after the war, when 19-year-old Louis XVI ascended the French throne. Louis XVI, by all accounts a shy and indecisive monarch, had married a beautiful 14-year-old Austrian archduchess named Maria Antonia 4 years before his coronation in 1774. While many of the French peasantry warmed quickly to their new queen, whose name was Gallicized to Marie Antoinette following the marriage, others disliked her from the start, as she was a member of one of the nations that had caused France such grief during the 7 Years' War. These disgruntled Frenchmen grew to resent her even more when they learned of the extravagant lifestyle she enjoyed, courtesy of often starving, as a result of poor harvests and subsequently soaring grain prices, French taxpayers. Marie Antoinette lived in Versailles, which had served as the capital of France since 1662, when King Louis XIV had his father's hunting lodge there transformed into the magnificent Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, built his palace as a gilded cage for France's power-hungry nobles, stipulating that each noble spend a certain amount of time living there each year, and implementing a court culture revolving around a series of elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to occupy the visiting nobles and prevent them from conspiring against him. This court culture was still very much alive when Marie Antoinette came to Versailles. To entertain herself amidst the ritual tedium, she indulged in fashion, gambling, and theater. Her heavy expenses earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. In addition to her lavish lifestyle, the French people began to take umbrage at their queen's apparent inability to produce an heir. Marie Antoinette did not conceive until 7 years after her marriage to Louis XVI, although it should be mentioned that many historians believe the fault more likely lay with her husband. Marie Antoinette's slowness to deliver a royal heir spurred political satirists to produce libelles, small, often obscene books designed to slander public figures, accusing her of outrageous, deviant behavior. The quantity and vulgarity of these pamphlets increased wildly in the latter years of the 18th century. According to American historian Robert Darnton, quote, "The avalanche of defamation that overwhelmed Marie Antoinette between 1789 and her execution on October 16, 1793, has no parallel in the history of vilification." The French people's aversion to the French elite didn't stop at the Queen, however. Many members of France's poor peasant class, known as the Third Estate, which made up about 95% of France's population, detested both the aristocracy and the high-ranking clergymen of the Catholic Church for the heavy taxes they levied upon them, taxes from which members of both of these upper classes were often exempt. In addition to the Third Estate, members of a growing middle class known as the bourgeoisie, literally town dwellers, which chiefly consisted of wealthier merchants and craftsmen, held the French elite in contempt for their monopoly on political power. Adding fuel to the fire were radical new Enlightenment ideas espoused by French intellectuals like Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire. These ideas, which circulated throughout France by way of coffeehouses and salons, included the notions of separation of power, consent of the governed, republicanism, and separation of church and state, ideas which contested the authority of France's absolute monarchy and the Catholic Church. The ideals of the Age of Enlightenment, which contributed massively to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's unpopularity, also contributed to the American Revolution, a conflict in which the inhabitants of Britain's 13 colonies rebelled against the authority of the British Crown. Eager to make up for France's humiliating defeat at the hands of the British during the 7 Years' War, Louis XVI entered the war against Great Britain in 1778. Although France only engaged in a handful of naval battles with British forces, it provided significant strategic and economic aid to American revolutionaries. Due in part to France's intervention, America won their War of Independence in 1783. While France's key role in America's victory over Britain restored much of the international prestige that it had lost during the 7 Years' War, it also exacerbated its already staggering debt. In order to combat France's mounting financial crisis, King Louis XVI appointed and dismissed a succession of financial ministers, whose proposed policies were either ineffective or unpopular with the king's advisors. Finally, in a desperate move, Louis XVI called a meeting with the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from France's 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. Although members of the Third Estate occupied the vast majority of the seats on the Estates General, which convened in Versailles in the spring and summer of 1789, their collective voice held as much weight as that of the much smaller First and Second Estates. Each estate was allowed 1 vote, no matter its size. When their appeals to establish representation by population were overturned, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, a body independent of the Estates General, which would address France's fiscal and agricultural issues with or without the members of the other 2 estates. In order to prevent this renegade body from convening, Louis XVI ordered the hall in which the National Assembly planned to meet to be closed on a false pretense. Undeterred, the National Assembly congregated in a proto-tennis court nearby. There, they swore the tennis court oath, a vow to continue to assemble until a constitution was established which would limit the power of the monarchy in the First and Second Estates. It just so happened that, around this time, in July 1789, King Louis XVI had sent foreign mercenaries to Paris to quell the bread riots, uprisings characterized by bakery lootings and vandalism in response to high bread prices that had plagued the city that summer. Members of the National Assembly, fearing that the incoming troops had come to put an end to their crusade, looted Parisian armories and armed themselves with muskets. Then, on July 14th, they stormed the Bastille, a medieval castle that served as an armory, political prison, and a symbol of royal tyranny. Supplemented by sympathetic members of the National Guard, the rioters quickly overwhelmed the fortress's few defenders. They celebrated their victory by decapitating the Bastille's governor and parading his head, mounted on a pike, through the streets. Expecting royal troops to respond to the attack, Parisian revolutionaries constructed makeshift barricades in the streets. Instead of countering the revolutionaries, however, the mercenaries that had arrived to quell the bread riots dispersed on the king's orders. Word of this victory over the French monarchy spread quickly throughout the country, and soon the nation was seething with the spirit of the revolution. On August 4th, the National Assembly took the next step towards popular sovereignty by abolishing feudalism. Later that month, they published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a constitution-like document championing freedom, equality, and sovereignty of the people. The months following the storming of the Bastille were characterized by peasant revolts and the establishment of free, often radical newspapers throughout France. Some of these newspapers incited violence against members of the First and Second Estates, and many nobles, fearing for their safety, left the country. In early October, a mob of angry peasant women marched on Versailles itself. This march, which began as a search for bread, evolved into a movement to bring King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the royal court away from the palace to Paris, where, they believed, the aristocracy could more effectively govern the French people. Upon reaching Versailles, the women elected 6 of their number to bring their entreaties to the king. These representatives gained audience with Louis XVI without trouble, and convinced him to distribute food to the mob. Many of the women, still unsatisfied, loitered around the palace. In a second attempt at pacification, Louis XVI signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which the women had brought with them. The Parisian women, still hoping to drag the king back to Paris, stayed the night outside the palace gates. Early the following morning, the mob discovered an open gate and stormed the palace, searching for the queen's bedchamber. In the process, they killed several guardsmen and mounted their heads on pikes. Eventually, Louis XVI defused the situation by emerging to address the mob. Without further violence, he, his family, and his courtiers accompanied the women back to Paris and took up residence in the Tuileries Palace. For 2 years, Louis XVI, held captive by National Assembly revolutionaries, governed France from Paris, regularly signing documents that eroded his power bit by bit. Fearful of the increasing fanaticism of the revolutionary movement, the king, at the behest of Marie Antoinette, decided to attempt to flee Paris with his family and make for the Austrian Netherlands, where he might raise an army with which to re-establish the old order. On the eve of June 21, 1791, the French royal family disguised themselves, piled into a single horse-drawn coach, and headed east. Unfortunately, they were recognized en route by a postmaster, who relayed the news of the royal journey to revolutionaries. The royal family made it to the town of Varennes en Argonne, only a few miles from the Austrian border, where they were captured by revolutionary forces and ultimately forced to return to Paris. Despite Louis XVI's attempt to flee France, the National Assembly allowed the king to continue to rule the nation, albeit with considerable restrictions to his authority. That fall, they finished drafting the French Constitution of 1791, France's first constitution, and promptly dissolved. Their successors, members of the new Legislative Assembly, shared power with the king, transforming France into a constitutional monarchy somewhat similar to Great Britain. In the spring of 1792, France declared war on Austria, which was governed at that time by Marie Antoinette's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Francis II, fearing that it would invade France with the goal of crushing the revolution and re-establishing the old regime. That summer, after suffering a number of crushing defeats at the hands of the Austrian army, the French learned that Prussia was about to join the war against them. The leader of the Prussian forces, a celebrated German general named Charles Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, drafted a proclamation known as the Brunswick Manifesto, which threatened to harm French citizens if anything happened to the royal family. The proclamation, which was intended to intimidate Parisians, backfired, spurring the radical revolutionary citizens, known as Fédères, and members of the National Guard, to storm the Tuileries Palace, where the French royal family lived, and engage in a ferocious battle with the king's Swiss guards. Although Louis XVI and his family managed to flee to the safety of the Legislative Assembly, the monarchy was effectively overthrown, if not officially. At that time, Austrian and Prussian forces were pushing towards Paris. Afraid that these foreign armies might take the city and supplement their ranks with Parisian prisoners, National Guardsmen and radical Fédères emptied Paris's dungeons and slaughtered their inhabitants en masse. These slaughters are referred to as the September Massacres. Later that month, following the Battle of Valmy, in which French troops decisively defeated Ferdinand's Prussian army, the Legislative Assembly officially declared the end of the French monarchy and the establishment of the First French Republic. Emboldened, the new republic put Louis XVI, now known by the common name Louis Capet, on trial for his treasonous attempt to flee France with his family on the night of June 21, 1791. The Capetian king was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death via guillotine, a newly invented decapitation machine which would become a hallmark of the reign of terror that would follow his death. He was publicly beheaded on January 21, 1793. His wife, Marie Antoinette, met a similar fate on October 16th of that year. According to legend, before her flight from Paris to Varennes, for which she and her husband were ultimately executed, Marie Antoinette packed up the crown jewels of France, along with her vast collection of rubies, diamonds, pearls, and other precious gems she had accumulated at Versailles. When she and her husband were captured in Varennes, however, the jewels were nowhere to be found. Legend has it that the French queen entrusted her most loyal servant, her lady-in-waiting, with the precious stones, and that the courtier managed to make her way across the Atlantic Ocean to the Acadian fort of Louisbourg, located in what is now Nova Scotia, following the capture of her mistress. Some Oak Island theorists believe that she, accompanied by loyalist French troops, later buried these jewels on Oak Island when it became clear that the French monarchy was no more. According to the late Oak Island researcher R.V. Harris in his book, The Oak Island Mystery, there are several potential problems with this theory. The most obvious problem is that most of France's crown jewels are not missing. In fact, they were stolen in 1792, a full year after the royal flight to Varennes, and were all eventually recovered. The second problem with this theory is the fact that Louisbourg, the French fort to which Marie Antoinette's lady-in-waiting purportedly brought the jewels, had been in British possession since the 1758 siege of Louisbourg during the 7 Years' War. Third, it seems unlikely that French troops could have buried treasure on Oak Island after 1791 and kept it a secret. Oak Island and the surrounding area had been inhabited by New English settlers since the mid-1700s. What do you think about this French crown jewels theory of Oak Island? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to support this channel, please check out the Oak Island Encyclopedia by clicking the link in the description.